In the West, we at least for the past decade, we always predicted that the Chinese and Russians would start to fight over Central Asia, but they don't. They attempt to accommodate each other's interests. No one is seeking hegemony, and thus they can avoid the zero-sum approach to security. I think the United States have tried everything now. They did a lot to sabotage China's technological industries, with the chip bans, encouraging other countries to decouple from China. They can put pressure on transportation corridors, access to finance. Again, there's a lot that the United States has done, but none of this is working. They could have done this maybe 10 or 20 years ago, but now China's too big. It's too late. The big change for Russia came in 2014. And there was two things that happened. One, the Greater Europe initiative they had died, and also an alternative Eurasian format emerged. So it's important to realize that for the past 300 years, since Peter the Great, Russia always looked towards the West for modernization, also since the early 18th century. In the West is where the main technologies were. The West also dominated the seas, as where the main transportation corridors are, which can physically connect the world. This was the area of financial connectivity of the world, so they had everything. This is why Russia's integration into an international economic system, pursuing prosperity and modernity, always meant to Europeanize Russia, to make it more European. Now, there's always been some concerns about this, especially those who read Dostoevsky, all these 19th century scholars arguing that perhaps Russia should look more towards the East. Anyways, after the Cold War, Russia continued this tradition of looking to the West. They wanted to make peace with the West. They wanted to modernize their economies. So they began to then pursue these very pro-Western policies. However, what they found out was that this Greater Europe was denied. That's what NATO expansion represented, that we were going to create a Europe without Russia. And a Europe without Russia quickly became a Europe against Russia, simply because we then had to compete over where the new dividing lines would be instead of removing them. So the problems always built up. And in 2014, this is when everything broke, because until then, many people in Russia thought, well, perhaps we can have an incremental integration with the West. But when the West toppled the government in Ukraine, this was the clear signal that Ukraine would not be a bridge, but it would be a front line. And when Russia took Crimea in order to safeguard its Black Sea fleet, then and all the sanctions came, even the few Russians who still wanted to pursue Greater Europe had to recognize this was utopia. It was never going to happen. And what happened at the same time, exactly the same time in 2013-14? Well, this is when China really began to lay the foundations for an alternative international economic system. That is, the Chinese began to push this Belt and Road Initiative. They started to more openly assert ambition to take technological leadership in the world. China began to advance these new financial institutions, be it the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, looking to internationalize its currency. We see that the SCO or BRICS, it represents a world order based on multipolarity, in which the great powers, they seek to harmonize interest with each other rather than pursue the dominance and global hegemony. And this is very important to recognize, because in the West, we at least for the past decade, we always predicted that the Chinese and Russians would start to fight over Central Asia, but they don't. They attempt to accommodate each other's interests. No one is seeking hegemony, and thus they can avoid the zero-sum approach to security. So suddenly a new system emerged in the East. So this was tremendously important time in history for Russia. When it goes to the East, it notices that it doesn't have the same historical baggage. It doesn't meet the same hostility. And even the fact that China is the biggest country there and not Russia, it actually works often to Russia's advantage. So I think 2014 was really the main era, because this is when Europe really slammed the door in the face of Russia, and a new door opened in the East, which was China. And that's when this greater Eurasia ambition really began to move forward. The main problem for Russia has always been it had unfavorable asymmetrical interdependence with the West. So we often say that interdependence between nations is good, it creates peace. Well, yes, to some extent, because in all interdependent relationships, one will always be more dependent on the other. So this goes with people as well as states. Now, when you have huge asymmetries, then one side can use that to extract political power from the rest. So let's say, for example, a relationship between the collective West and Russia. If 90% of Russian trade is dependent on the West, while 3% of the West trade is dependent on Russia. This is asymmetrical. Now the West it's much less dependent on Russia than Russia is on the West, and the West can use this to extract political concessions. Now, and this is what we saw. We saw that Russia being dependent on the West for its technologies, access to transportation corridors, banks, currencies, payment systems, insurance systems, everything. The only thing really Europe was dependent on Russia was energy. And we did everything we could to reduce this, to have maximized interdependence. Because in any interdependent relationship, you get some influence, but you lose some autonomy. If you have asymmetrical interdependence, you maintain your autonomy and you get influence over the other. So this is the problem for Russia. This was the condition for creating a Europe without Russia. How can you have a Europe where we leave out the largest country on the continent? For Russia, if they want to have some political autonomy and security and act as an independent pole of power in a multipolar world, they need to diversify their partnerships. Yes, they need some strategic autonomy in key sectors, for example, technology, energy, but they need to diversify partnerships, and this is what they failed to do. So ideally, Russia would, be very close with China, but also India, Iran, Korea, Japan, but also the EU, US, to have as many partners as possible, so no one can bully it. So this excessive dependence on the West is really the mistake I would refer to, which was very damaging for Russia. What I argued is that the Russians will be somewhat concerned not to recreate this in the East. In other words, Russia's pivot to the East can't simply become a pivot to China. Why? Well, because China is much, much more powerful, at least economically, than Russia. So it doesn't want to get stuck in a partnership where, again, 95% of its trade is dependent on China and 2% of Chinese trade is dependent on Russia, because that would be a very uneven relationship. So this means Russia really has to diversify its partnerships. Yeah? So not just integrate with China, but also look a bit to India, Iran, Korea, and also the rest of the world. And what has been a very pleasant experience for the Russians is that China is okay with it. They're not sabotaging it. And this is something new to the Russians, because whenever Western countries have deal with Ukraine, Central Asia, Turkey, Armenia, a key objective is always to decouple them from the Russians, to sever ties between them. The Chinese have never done this, and part of the reason is because China is happy with the multipolar system. If China wanted to recreate a Chinese hegemony to replace an American one, they would have tried to cut Russia's tie from other states and made it subordinate. But it's not doing this, and this is what is very reassuring to the Russians, and this is also an indicator why we're seeing a multipolar system emerge, where yes, China is the leading state, but it's not seeking to dominate others. I wrote this book a decade ago. It's Russia's Geoeconomic Strategy for Greater Eurasia, where I kind of pointed out that this soft balancing has to be in place in order for the integration or Greater Eurasia to be durable. But at this moment, they're getting deeply involved with the Chinese partnership, and they're very comfortable with it because they can maintain their political autonomy. So again, 10 years ago, this book wasn't received that well. People said it's marriage of convenience. There's never going to be any de-dollarization. This was almost science fiction. But we see 10 years later now, this is the direction things are going, because states will seek what I call a balance of dependence. Well, it's also become a cliche that one hegemon or one leading power doesn't hand over the mantle peacefully to the next one. There's usually conflict. And I think the United States have tried everything now. They did a lot to sabotage China's technological industries, with the chip bans. They're encouraging other countries to decouple from China. They can put pressure on transportation corridors, access to finance. Again, there's a lot that the United States has done. But none of this is working. They could have done this maybe 10 or 20 years ago, but now China's too big, it's too late. So this is why the United States is now leaning towards militarizing the rivalry instead, and that's why it's important with a proxy. Well, it doesn't have to be Taiwan, it could also be Philippines, because it's great empires, they try not to fight with their own troops. Also, if you don't want to fight a huge great power like Russia or China with your own military, it will be devastating. They probably would lose, and it could escalate into nuclear war. So it's better to fight with proxies. And if you're going to fight the Russians, then obviously for them Ukraine will be the best proxy to fight. Now with the Chinese, you would use Taiwan or Philippines most likely, which is where the Americans are now sending their weapons, encouraging more antagonistic relationship with Beijing. This is what the direction the Americans are going. Under the One China principle, the Americans should limit themselves to economic and cultural ties to Taiwan. Instead, we're seeing now that they're sending their top politicians there, which is a breach. They're sending military trainers there, which is a breach. And they're step by step trying to dismantle it. So asking for more representation for Taiwan in international institutions such as the UN. So effectively beginning to give it the status of a sovereign country, which is not correct, because our peace and stability with China is based on this principle that there is one China. Taiwan is a part of China. And if we try to abandon this, then there will be war. And it's not in China's interest to use military force against Taiwan. I think China is quite confidently sees as its economy grows, it will able to integrate Taiwan more through peaceful means, economic connectivity. So waiting for more favorable government perhaps. So the only reason why I think China would use military force is if the Americans are pushing for Taiwan secession. I think that's the red line for China. Now, the Chinese should be careful, because if the Americans are looking for a proxy war, like they did with Ukraine, because keep in mind, in Ukraine, the same thing happened. The Russians went in because America sabotaged all peace agreements. They went in with the military, which was this unprovoked invasion. And on the first day, they attempted they reached out to the Ukrainians to start peace negotiations, which they did. And then the Americans came and sabotaged it because they wanted a war, and they chose a war. And this is why one should be careful not to walk into a similar trap over Taiwan. But China and Russia have different relationship with Washington over the past 30 years, because China had a more favorable position. The Russians, they had a military bloc gradually expanding on their border. They were never offered a status quo. Instead, they had to see NATO march slowly on its borders, with the repercussions being quite predictable. So this often made it necessary for Russia to punch above its weight, to really flex its muscles beyond even what it had the capability to match with action. Now, China was a bit of the opposite. Favorable, there was no military bloc marching on its borders. It tried to not create any waves. So what's also called a peaceful rise, just try not to create too much draw too much attention to itself, which would make the American empire strike against China, try to knock it down. So this is why we saw the different paths by the Chinese and the Russians. But now, of course, China's become too powerful for America's comfort. So now they kind of have to come out of the closet as well and start to push back, which is what we're seeing.
朋友都知道我是很挑剔的，防晒乳我选 KISS 皇家呵护抗光清爽高防晒凝露，因为它有媲美蓝光神盾的抓藻植萃。保护我在阳光下延缓肌肤老化，维持青春弹力，可以防御工作环境里的3C 商品、各种光源对肌肤的伤害，擦起来清爽不黏腻。我特别喜欢它做到海洋友善，365天，天天抗光抗老化，是我的保养日常。你呢？呵护你，呵护全家人，专属你的 KISS Royal Care 抗光清爽高防晒凝露。